All right, so we got the recording going. Um, so thanks everybody for joining us today to hear uh, from the WARS Update project team on the update, a progress report on the WARS Update project, including some recent developments, upcoming work, and then we'll have an opportunity for staff to have questions at the end. So my name is Jordan Beamer. I'm an assistant manager in the surface water section and serve as a project sponsor for this project, and joined by Ryan Andrews, a hydrologist and the project manager for this project. So some quick ground rules for this. Uh, Please just keep your mic on mute, and we'll be holding questions at the end. But you can also feel free to put questions you have in the chat. And when we get to questions, you can use the raise hand function. So with that, I'll pass it off to Ryan to start the presentation. Thanks.
Ready. Welcome, everybody. Good morning. I'm going to share my screen here. Into presentation mode. All right. Hopefully that works for everybody. Good morning. I'm Ryan Andrews. I'm a hydrologist in the surface water section, and I am the project manager for the WARS Update project, and here to give a progress report, update people on the status of what we've been working on, project developments, and what's to come, as Jordan mentioned. So just to kick us off, what is the purpose of this presentation? Did want to start off with some background on the water availability reporting system, or as it's well known throughout the department, WARS. Then give an overview of the project and why we're doing it, what we're hoping to get out of it, and who's involved. Lots of detail about that. And then talk a bit about the project timeline, give people an idea of when this started, when things are going to happen, and then when we're hoping to wrap this up by. And then finally, we'll talk about the work that we've been doing, and we'll give a bit about next steps. So just to start, for people who don't know or aren't familiar with WARS, or maybe haven't interacted with it very much, I did want to give a bit of background about it before we talk about why we're updating it. So WARS stands for the Water Availability Reporting System, and what it is it's a database containing information about water availability for Oregon's surface waters. And so water availability refers to the amount of water that's available for allocation. And so this information is used, as you could imagine, to evaluate applications for surface water rights. And so this is sort of our accounting system to track the impacts of allocated water on stream flow throughout the state. So we use it to evaluate water right applications, and we use it to look at what's already been given out and how it compares to the stream flows that we see throughout the state. And so this image on the right is the cover of the report called Determining Surface Water Availability in Oregon. And this was published in 2002. And really, this is the guide or the manual for learning about what water availability, what WARS is, how water availability was calculated, and what information went into it, and somewhat about how to use that information or the limitations of that information. Somewhat importantly to know, as we get into talking about developing this model later, but this, so sometimes you'll hear, or you can see in the name, it's called a system. But this system is made up of different tools or applications, desktop applications, that were used to calculate water availability. And within that system, there is a modeling framework, or a model as it's typically called. And this is a statistical model that was used to calculate the stream flow and water availability across the state. There's other kinds of models, physical models, but sometimes those give us different information than we're interested in in terms of water availability here. But just important to note that this is a statistical model. And why that's important to know is that the information that it's produced as it currently sits today, as WARS exists today, that information related to water availability and natural stream flow is calculated to represent this climate period of 1958 to 1987. So it's pretty obvious that that information is relatively old at this point and needs to be updated. So getting into hinting at why we're updating this, why we're updating the system. And just a bit about how we calculate water availability. So this equation at the top, I'll go and explain what the acronyms are. But just wanted a simple representation of how we derive water availability, although how you calculate each of these components is a bit more complex than it's depicted here. So water availability is derived from natural stream flow. So natural stream flow is this QNSF variable. And so this is a value that's calculated using data that's collected by Oregon Stream Gauging Network. So these are gauges that are operated by our agency and a number of others, mainly the USGS, US Geological Survey. So we use this information to calculate water availability on a statewide scale. And so that starts by calculating stream flow characteristics. And from that, we then debit out our expected demands. And so these three variables here, ST is our storage demands, CU is our out-of-stream consumptive uses, so things like irrigation, municipal, and other de minimis uses like domestic or commercial water rights. And then, of course, we have our in-stream demands as well. And so this includes anything from claims, tribal claims, our in-stream water rights, and scenic waterways. Another thing to note here is that included in the expected demands are things like reservations or water that has been set aside for future use or other purposes, but we want to factor that in because it's been set aside either through decrees or treaties or something else that states that that water exists for a specific purpose. So really simply, we are determining how much water is available by considering what streams typically exhibit in their flows and what we've already allocated in terms of our expected demands. And we want to do this to avoid over appropriating our streams or at least allocating in a responsible manner. So what do we use for WARS here for at the department? Mainly, this is the main tool for evaluating water right applications. So really, this provides a consistent way to evaluate applications based on some standards that were established in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, and we want to provide up-to-date information. So really, it helps us provide consistency in how we evaluate applications. We use it to account for the reserved water, as I was mentioning before, and other requirements, and making sure that we are considering those requirements when we're thinking about allocating water for other purposes. And it also provides access to location-based information that's useful for other programs like evaluating grant applications. And it's useful for planning groups to figure out how they can plan for their water futures. And it's used by consultants as well to help their clients in their evaluation, determining whether they're going to be able to get a water right or reasonably use a water right. And it's useful for other interested parties like ODFW and when they're considering in-stream water right applications as well. This map shows water availability in August at the 80% exceedance flow. So something I haven't talked about yet is if we calculate water availability at the 80% and 50% exceedance flow, Really simply, what this is it describes how often a certain flow rate of water is available. And so the 80% exceedance flow is used to evaluate applications for out of stream uses or those consumptive uses. So things like irrigation. And so this month shows our most limited month in terms of water availability. So August, we're seeing that there's not much water, if any, available for most of the state, only in a few select locations like the Willamette, main stem Willamette, some few places in northeastern Oregon, and then some places along the coast as well. But this just represents August, so we typically make these maps on a monthly basis. And we also calculate water availability at the 50% exceedance flow. And so that's what this map represents for January. And 50% exceedance flow is used to evaluate applications for storage and for in-stream water rights. And so we can see that there is more opportunity for storage throughout the state, and both western and even parts of eastern Oregon as well. And then, yeah, again, 50% exceedance flow is used to evaluate in-stream water right applications, which is somewhat of a different process. So starting to dig into the purpose of the WARS Update project, this project is the outcomes are mainly to develop a modeling system that is used to calculate water availability for Oregon surface waters and implement that new information into department operations by January 1st of 2030. This timeline is directed by the policy option package, POP 111 from the 2023-2025 biennium. So we received that money and have started putting it to use, but really that has kind of guided what this project is supposed to produce and the timeline for it and the budget for it. So there's three main purposes for doing this. So we want to update the water availability model itself and then use it to calculate information that's representative of today's climate. So there's this 30-year period of record. If you remember, the current information is representative of 1958 to 1987. We want to move that climate period forward to 1991 to 2020. This aligns with recommendations by organizations like the World Meteorological Organization that just help set standards to help people understand like how to calculate information, particularly in a statistical manner. We realize that by the end of this project, this itself will be 10 years old. But part of this update is so that we can develop a system that helps us calculate this more regularly and provide updates more quicker and more frequently. We also want to use this information to improve decision making for the department. So things like allocating water, especially since we've just updated our recent groundwater rules. There's a lot of programs that depend on having updated information. So that's a major need for this project. And then we want to provide that information, not just for us, but for other information or interested parties as well. There are several problems that this project is intended to address that are related to those purposes that we just talked about. So really, obviously, the first one is that the current information represents an older climate period. And part of this is related to updating the resolution of the model as well. So there's places throughout the state, or there's interest in smaller streams that may not be well represented by our model. And so we want to try and get better information for these areas so that we can also use that information for better decision making. And this has been a need highlighted, not just within our agency, but by places like the Department of Fish and Wildlife as well. So they rely on this information, and so they've pointed that out as a need. The water use information needs to be updated. So This relates to how we calculate consumptive use. You may have heard of the OpenET information that has been that project that's been going on at our agency for a number of years now. So that has produced a lot of information that would be helpful in determining things like consumptive use. So the way it was done in the 90s for WARS is they used some science and research that was available at the time, but that is decades old at this point. And there's newer technology and information available to help us update that component of the water availability equation. Another thing is that our current gauge network is really designed for management. We have over 200 gauges that our agency operates, and a lot of those are designed to help our field staff make decisions about regulation. And so it's designed for management purposes, but we do have gauges that provide good information for science. But that number of gauges is relatively low in comparison, and we can't use all of the gauge data that we have. Some of the gauges are impacted by significant use or storage upstream, and we're interested in gauges that are less impacted by anthropogenic use. And so part of this project is to help us collect more information that represents the natural flow conditions. Number 4, there is a significant backlog of streamflow records that need to be published. And this is just due to lack of people to help our hydrographics program publish these records. Just given that large number of gauges, that's a lot of gauges to run and manage the data for. And so a significant part of this project is to help us publish those records so that we can reliably use them in our modeling efforts. And lastly on here is that the current system for updating the model and maintaining the system is semi-functional. So we have a suite of applications that we use to help us calculate water availability. But some of them aren't in the greatest shape, and we need to update them so that we can perform these updates more regularly. So getting into the specifics about the project team, this diagram shows the different subgroups of the project, and then on the right lists out the individuals associated with each group. So I did want to shout out all of these people that have been engaged and made this project really really move forward over the past couple of years. So really just want to thank them for their efforts and engagement throughout this. So we have a project sponsor group composed of Annette Leva, Rachel Levelford, and Jordan Beamer. I am the project manager, and then there are several different subgroups within the project core team. So we have a group of hydrologists, Chengwei Wang, Courtney Cameron, Cameron Greenwood, and then a brand new hire, Junji Chen, who just started yesterday. They'll all be helping with the hydrology work associated with this project. Laura Tesler is our policy lead for this project, and then Michael Smith and Paul Post are our immediate IT support. In our project charter, we've identified likely needs for technical support from several different program areas throughout the agency. Hydrographics has already been helping us quite a bit with gauge publication and coordinating an effort to expand our gauge network. Similar with field services, we've been in touch with them to help us plan the gauge network expansion. And then these other groups we will most certainly be in touch with as we move throughout this project: groundwater, water rights, the comms team, PCI, you name it. We are most likely going to be in touch with you at some point, if we haven't been already, to help us understand what, get your subject matter expertise so that we can incorporate it into this project. Talking a little bit about project management, I did just want to give people an idea of what we're doing to stay organized throughout this project, because I believe that's probably the most important part to having a successful project. So we began by putting together these management artifacts that help us understand like what it is we're trying to do here. So establish our goals, outline all of the work that's involved, and help us document our progress and share that out. So our project charter really describes what the purpose of this project is, lists out who's involved or who we expect to be involved. And so that's quite a list of people, just so that they're aware that at some point we're going to be reaching out, and here's the need and why we're doing it, and also list out our desired outcomes. Our team charter really helps detail the roles and responsibilities of everyone involved in here, and it helps us set expectations for how we can work together, stay organized, and really rely on each other to have success with this work. And our comms plan helps us ensure that coordination among project team members, but also engaging with interested parties to whatever degree we need to. So this includes people throughout the agency that aren't necessarily part of the project core team, but might provide technical support or otherwise, and list out other interested parties that are external to the agency, and what sort of degree of involvement they might have throughout this. Finally, we are planning to put together a project website and aiming to go live on July 1st so that we can share any updates like this or make documentation available for people to look at whenever they have time. So I mentioned a bit about staff engagement, but really wanted to talk about that here. We are expecting to engage with other subject matter experts, like I was mentioning before, that aren't part of the project core team. And this is to help us inform our technical work. So we've identified either program areas or specific individuals or positions in our charter and listed out what sort of involvement we might expect from them. So throughout our project meetings, for instance, we've been chatting with our data techs who are involved in, say, mapping stuff for risk. And we needed to know from that group, what can we expect in terms of working with the risk and getting the information from it? What are the risks associated with it? So these people know best. And so really we're consulting with them so that we can understand and plan for our work. And we expect to do that with others throughout the agency as we get to that point, throughout these next couple months at least, to help us understand our risks and the work that we expect to do over the next few years. Another thing that we would like to do is establish an internal work group composed of different representatives from program areas throughout the agency. And so this is not only about informing our technical work, but we realize there's a lot of policy implications associated with this project. And so our project team is composed of a lot of technical experts, and we have just one project core team member associated with policy, but there is quite a depth and breadth of policy related to either water availability or program areas that it's related to. And so we may need some support from others who are more familiar in those areas. And so this internal working group would help us remain in coordination with people who know best in their specific program areas and what we should be aware of as we work through this project over the next few years. And also to develop use cases for people who are the customers of this system and its database. So water rights staff who are the biggest users of this data on a daily basis. So how can we develop this system to be most compatible with their work? This slide shows the main deliverables that are associated with this project. I don't want to go into great detail here, but just skimming through these. So we've hired 8 new positions to support this work, and that comes from the policy option package. We are aiming to install up to 10 new gauging stations to help us collect more data and information for this to support this project now and into the future. We've established 30 new weather stations that support the OpenET project and indirectly help this project, ultimately calculating things like consumptive use. The Streamflow record publication, so publishing a great number of records for our stream gauge network. I've mentioned the updated water availability model itself, so the data and methods that go into that, and then the information that is produced by the system. A software system and database. So the software system is going to be applications that let us interface with the model without changing the underlying code, and then storing information in a database. And finally, I'll talk about this a bit more, is we're putting together a technical advisory group that will help us inform the strategy for how we develop this model. And finally, we'll compile all of what we did, all of the work that we did and how we did it in a peer-reviewed report similar to the one that I showed at the beginning of this presentation. Here's a project timeline color-coded to match the 5 blocks underneath for the different phases of this project. We are currently in Q2 of 2025. So that is this inception phase here. We've already kind of initiated our project, putting together a project team and understanding what we're doing here. Right now, we're trying to understand our risks and any major decisions that need to be made, either now or throughout our project, and outline get an understanding of the work that we'll be doing in the elaboration phase and beyond, and start to understand what the requirements of our system are. Things like data requirements, how we're going to calculate things, and other things that we need to consider, like policy considerations. And then beyond that, we start to get some more specificity into the modeling system itself, and then we'll start to build it out. And this transition phase is when we'll start to formally calculate water availability. So start to populate that database to make produce information that will ultimately be what's relied on in decision making. And then we need to plan in a period to where we start to implement this data into different program areas or other operations that rely on this data. So a bit more about this inception phase that we're in right now. Really, what we're trying to do here is outline this water availability modeling framework. So this is kind of the conceptual workflow that describes the flow of data through a number of processes and ultimately producing water availability data or information. So this phase helps us define what we need to build in order to achieve the goals of our project. So that the water availability model, that software system and database is what we're trying to describe, provide an initial description of here. And one of the major things that we're doing at this point is understanding our risks and the decisions that we need to make about data, methods, upcoming work, and outcomes. And I'll show a little bit about that here in a second. So our process involves our hydrology group and others consulting with subject matter experts throughout the agency. So I mentioned a bit about us interacting with the data techs and another IT staff about risk itself, and engaging with other subject matter experts or program areas. So we sit down for about an hour to have a lengthy discussion and go in depth into the weeds about things that we need to know about anything and everything. So these brainstorming sessions to help understand the depth and breadth of issues related to water availability. And we're capturing that information on a Miro board, which I want to just show people to give an idea of like the actual work that we're producing here. So once this loads, we'll get an idea. Bear with me for a second. Okay, so I'll zoom out just to give you an idea of the scale of this. If you haven't used Miro before, it's a pretty cool tool. But we have these different boards related to different topic areas, like publishing streamflow records, calculating streamflow characteristics, how we're going to calculate consumptive use, things like that. And so I'm going to zoom into our discussion or our board about calculating streamflow characteristics. And on the left over here, you can see this diagram that's kind of showing the flow of information from a database to different data sets. And then we're going to go through this process of calculating flow metrics from gauge data. And then ultimately that information is going to get sent to a database. And so here we try to capture any questions that we have about anything related to this overall process. So things like what is the earliest in terms of data that we can use? So can we use data from 1900 or should we use data only from 1980 and beyond? Those are the sorts of level of detail of questions that we're trying to answer here, or at least capture so that we can answer later on. We try to capture any actions that we can take now or have to plan for in the future in terms of work. And then we capture any risks associated with it. So what if there are trends in the stream flow, and how can we use that information in our decision making and plan for that, because that can actually have a big impact on how we use the information from this.
Ryan,
and
can
then,
you
yeah.
possibly get that a little larger? I mean, I don't know if it's pretty small for folks to see, is what we're
Sure.
hearing from the crowd.
Yeah, sorry. So yeah, these little post-it
Is that a little
notes.
better for folks? It's kind of hard with Miro because you have to kind of go in and out. So that's about, is that a little better from folks?
It's much better, but yeah, just to move it around a little bit would be awesome, Ryan. Thank you.
Sure, no problem. And
Okay.
this is linked in here, and anybody can view this board later on. So yeah, the main point here is to just capture, just to show the sorts of things we're doing in these brainstorming sessions. So it can seem a little obscure when you're first starting out, like project planning, like what are we brainstorming about? But really, it's just so that we can fully understand anything that we may encounter throughout our work and best plan for it, so that we can mitigate any sort of circumstances where we're like, oh no, we have to go back and redo this thing. So we want to minimize those number of situations. And then down below, we try to identify any dependencies, known dependencies in terms of who is involved, what other processes are involved, or previous work is going to feed into this work. So feel free to take a look at this once these slides get sent out. I think it's pretty handy for people to take a look at. And so the outcomes from this work, so this is just going to produce a ton of notes, as you could imagine. We're condensing that down into summaries. And then we're using that information to develop this scope of work that details the different, what we're calling hydrologic investigations or analyses that we're going to use to identify any requirements for the model framework. So I mentioned these like minimum data requirements, for instance, or what sort of ways we're going to calculate data. We're going to go, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a couple slides. So we're going to conduct these investigations to better detail the requirements of our system and really try and define and schedule our work so that we can adhere to our project timeline. So our deliverables that are in progress at the moment. So we have a gauge network expansion, and I'll talk about each one of these in detail. Gauge network expansion project, gauge record publication, a technical advisory group, and then these hydrologic analyses that we've been working on. So just to start with, I'll talk about the gauge network expansion. So I mentioned that we wanted to install up to 10 new gauges to monitor natural flow for this project. And so this map on the right shows some of our candidate watersheds. So these aren't necessarily where we're going to install gauges. What we're doing right now is taking field visits to help us understand the feasibility of installing these gauges in terms of getting to the site, the quality of information the site would produce, making sure that we have the staff to maintain these gauges, because for instance, this site way down here in southeastern Oregon, as you could imagine, it's a couple hours away from our nearest field office and is pretty remote. So really trying to get an understanding of how likely it is that we can collect quality information from any of our candidate locations. And so we identified these sites based off of some statistical analysis of our current gauge network and really wanted to identify gaps in where we don't have information. So if you're not familiar with our gauge network, this part of the state, the south central, southeastern part of the state lacks data, but where it does have data, it may be pretty significantly impacted by upstream use. So where can we collect information that would be useful for our water availability model? And then, of course, we're informing those decisions based off field visits with our hydrographics program and regional field staff as well. We also are interested in doing outreach to other gauge operators in the area. So we've come across gauges on our visits that are currently operated, but not by us. And so we want to reach out to those groups to see if there's any interest in cooperation or whether they can help generate support for the individual stations, because they can also benefit from the information collected by the gauges as well. And really, the main point of this is to install gauges that monitor natural stream flow, particularly. So we've been around the state. We've done 4 visits already. We have another one coming up next week in the southwest area. We're going to visit 4 sites down there in the Rogue and the South Coast basins. And then we're going to wrap up by heading up to northeastern Oregon in the Powder and John Day basins. So happy to talk about that project more if anybody's interested. Moving on into the gauge record publication. So I mentioned that there is a backlog of unpublished streamflow records. So just for quick background, our hydrographics program publishes gauge records and they progress through 4 stages of publication. So they start at raw and then they go through these phases, preliminary and provisional, and then finally they reach a stage of published, which indicates that the record has been reviewed several times by the program and may have gone through a series of corrections to finally produce this value that best represents the stream flow value for that time or day. And so this table on the right outlines the number of records or the number of gauges of interest to our project. So this doesn't capture all of the gauges, but these are gauges of interest to the Water Availability Update project. And so you can see the number varies by basin, by administrative basin, and we have a total of 173 gauges of interest. And associated with those gauges, there are almost 1,500 unpublished water years of record. And it can take anywhere from a day to up to several days to publish one water year of record, depending on the location and other factors affecting the gauge, the data collected by the gauge. So we needed to make a decision on whether we published through 2020 or we published through 2024. And so we went through some assessment to help inform our decision. And so we're going to aim to publish through 2024 and adjust as necessary according to this target date. So we want to be done publishing data by June of 2028, which coincides with our formal calculations of water availability. And our hydrographics program is going to publish by administrative basin on sort of a regional approach because it's useful to use information from proximal gauges or gauges that are nearby to each other to help work those records. And so they're going to start in the southwest and sort of move to the northwest and proceed, ultimately ending up with the south central region. And this is just tentative at this point, but this is a strategy we've discussed so far. Moving on into the technical advisory group. So this, I mentioned, is something we wanted to establish for this project. And so this is going to be composed of a group of subject matter experts that help provide feedback regarding our proposed work, including things like data and methods. So they're going to take a look at the things that we produce in our hydrologic analyses, and they're going to give us feedback, and we're going to help use that to inform the decisions that we make about how the model is developed. And this image on the right sort of shows the engagement model with this group. And so we'll start by producing a technical memo that describes the work in our hydrologic analysis. We'll engage with the group in quarterly meetings and give them an opportunity to provide feedback there. And we'll also share the document to collect any written feedback that they might have, and then use that information to make revisions, discuss those, and ultimately finalize the memo. The main purpose of putting this group together is to build support throughout the project and develop enough buy-in so that once we get to the implementation phase, we've already gone through the process of having input from other experts so that we don't need to go back and make any major revisions before anybody else has reviewed the work. We're seeking experts from state and federal agencies, academia, private consulting, and tribes. We've sent out 36 invites. Director Gall sent those on our behalf, and we've gotten interest from over 20 people, which is pretty remarkable in my opinion. And so we're starting to put together our plan for responding and engaging with that group. So we've scheduled out some meetings and have that structure in place. So we're going to be responding to interested parties within the next week. I mentioned these hydrologic analyses, so I just wanted to talk a bit about what that means. So really what we're going to be doing is analyzing available data and doing some literature review of available research to inform how water availability is calculated. So the results from this will inform our data requirements for how we develop the model and determine methods for calculating those components of water availability, things like natural stream flow and consumptive use. And here's some examples that I've listed out below of what I'm talking about. So minimum gauge data requirements. So it's talking about what's the earliest year that we could use data from, how much data does a gauge need to have to be able to be used in our model. I'll talk a bit about this streamflow trend analysis in a second. How we calculate consumptive use, how we consider groundwater surface water interactions is a massive undertaking for this project. And other things like how we calculate natural stream flow on a statewide scale, so this regional regression approach. So really a lot of work to help us detail how this stuff gets factored into our model. This is an example of one of our hydrologic analyses that tries to answer the question of whether there are significant trends in stream flow over time. So this work was performed by Courtney Cameron. If you have questions, she is available to answer those, but we're still working on this. The results are still preliminary, so we're still trying to understand what the results indicate. And so this map on the right shows the gauges that we use. These are natural flow gauges. So there's 51 of them, and the different colors, darker colors indicate there's more years of record. But at a minimum, these gauges had 30 years of record. And so what this work tried to do, this is just an example figure. And what this work tried to do is tried to understand whether streams were exhibiting a significant increase or decrease or no trend at all in their flow characteristics over time. And so this figure shows a bar chart by month for the percentage of those 51 gauging stations and how many showed a significant trend either upward or downward in their 50% exceedance flow, so their median stream flow. And you can see here that there's relatively few that exhibited a downward trend, which is the slashed bar chart. Relatively few in the winter months, but once you get into August and September, you see a significant increase in the number of gauges that are showing a downward trend in their stream flow, in their median stream flow. So the results of this we're still working through and really trying to understand how we can use this information to help us develop our model or how it should be used in decision making for allocating water in the future, or provide an indication of how often the model should be updated. So still working through this, but this gives you an idea of the work that we'll take to the technical advisory group and what information we need to process from it. Getting close to the end here, I did want to give a bit of idea about what we're doing to review water availability policy. So we're planning on, we've scoped out a project that will help us evaluate existing policy, rule, and statute that relates to water availability. And really, we're hoping that we can understand how it directs us to develop and use water availability information in our decision making. And the outcomes listed below are to help us understand, help us align water availability information with available policy, develop guidance for appropriate use of that information, and account for any sort of requirements that are listed in things like basin program rules or other documents like treaties or decrees, and make sure that we're capturing and reflecting all of that in water availability database. Finally, our next steps. So right now, working on planning to onboard our technical advisory group in July, and that would coincide with our project webpage going live for internal and external interested parties. And then pretty soon here, we're going to wrap up our field visits for our gauge network expansion and then compile all of our information to help us decide on where we're going to install our new gauges. And then, of course, we're still in the process of these brainstorming sessions to understand our risks and issues and things like that. So I do want to wrap up and give us some time for questions. So thanks for sitting through that presentation, and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
And before we go to questions, can we please stop the recording?